Inside of St George's Chapel, Westminster Abbey and the Tower of London's chapel, there are many of England's kings and queens buried. Some over the centuries have had their coffins and burial vaults opened, and what was found inside was remarkable. For example, Edward I, his tomb was opened 5 centuries after his death, and it was discovered that his remains were very well preserved, so well preserved that his face was recognisable. Inside the Tower of London's small church, the bones and remains of Queen Anne Boleyn, the most notorious wife of Henry VIII, were discovered, and these were then later reburied with much more dignity than they went into the ground. St George's Chapel is one of the most populated burial sites of the royal family, and the royal vault underneath is even becoming rather crowded. And because of this, a burial ground was created for the future monarchs' families to be interred in. In this video, we will look at the different stories of the men and women buried inside of the royal vaults across England and document what happened when these vaults were opened. Some incredible things were found. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It was Henry III who rebuilt Westminster Abbey to honour Edward the Confessor, whose relics and body were placed in a burial vault and shrine in the centre of the abbey. Around this, many of the kings and queens of medieval England are buried in large tombs and shrines. Most of the kings and queens of England from Edward the Confessor's time onwards until the death of King George III in 1760, are buried at Westminster, including most of the Tudors, excluding Henry VIII, the victor of the Wars of the Roses, Edward IV, and the executed King Charles I, who are all buried close to each other inside of St George's in Windsor. Following George III's death, most monarchs were buried in Windsor. But the tombs of the kings and queens of Westminster Abbey have been opened a number of times throughout the years. There are 17 English, Scottish and British monarchs buried in the Abbey, and the final 2 buried with full tomb effigies are Elizabeth I and the executed Mary, Queen of Scots. We will now explain some of the burial vaults inside of Westminster Abbey and the tombs, and what happened when these were opened. One of the most powerful medieval monarchs to rule over England was Edward I, who is often known as the Hammer of the Scots. Edward was a warring king, but he was very well respected. But following his death in July of 1307, his body was taken to Westminster Abbey in burial. Edward I's corpse had been well prepared, and he wrapped tightly in a cerecloth, which was renewed with wax years later. His tomb was opened in 1774, 4 centuries after his death, and what was discovered was remarkable. It was said that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard. A sinking or dip between the chin and the upper lip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on that part of the bridge of the nose which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshy part of the eyeballs, was movable in their sockets under the envelope. Edward I had been buried in some rich clothes which had also survived very well, and it was said that over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask, above that a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast, and on this, at 6 inches distant from each other, quatrefoils of filigree work of gilt metal set with stones imitating rubies, sapphires, amethyst. Edward I's tomb itself is a vault, and he is interred within this, and it is very different to other kings' tombs, as it is not covered with an effigy, and instead is very plain. Buried close to Edward I is Henry V, the skilled commander of the English at the Battle of Agincourt. Henry died whilst in France, and his body was then repatriated back to England, and he was interred inside of Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422. His funeral was huge, and he wanted a chantry chapel to be built over his tomb, and this is what happened. Still today, Henry V's body is kept in the vault under this tomb, and the vault under the Chantry chapel that was built around it, and this tomb does stand out when compared to others. It is more lavishly decorated, and on top of the tomb is a lifelike effigy of Henry V that does show the king in a very close resemblance to portraits of him, and this was probably made from his funeral effigy, which was placed on top of his coffin. Henry V's tomb was opened in 1953, over 500 years after his death. It's not known why his tomb was opened, but some work previously had been done around the tomb, and it was discovered that the body of another man was interred practically in the same vault as Henry. The reality of this was that the work had disturbed the floor of Henry V's Chantry chapel, and found within, nearby in a stone-lined grave, holding a crozier and a gold ring, was the body of Richard Courtenay, the Bishop of Norwich and close friend of Henry V. Henry V had him buried in the abbey, and it may have been stipulated that the king wanted his close friend buried nearby. It would also have been rude not to mention the fate of King Henry V's queen, Catherine of Valois. Catherine was left unburied for 400 years, and her remains were even shown to tourists inside of the abbey, and Samuel Pepys, the diarist, kissed the remains of the deceased queen on his birthday, seeing this as a rather morbid birthday present, defiling the dead. She was left in a box, disinterred for centuries. It's not known why she was not interred in the vault of her husband, Henry V, and it may have been due to her second husband being the grandfather of King Henry VII, and the Tudor king wanted to distance himself from Catherine of Valois and Owain Tudor, her husband. Catherine's coffin was buried eventually, moved, and it was buried within a vault under St Nicholas's Chapel in 1778, and her remains were then moved to a permanent burial site under a new altar created in Henry V's Chantry. This burial spot, her final burial spot under the altar in a vault, contains an inscription which states, "Under this slab, once the altar of this chapel, for a long cast dawn and broken up by fire, rest at last, after various vicissitudes, finally deposited here by command of Queen Victoria, the bones of Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, King of France, wife of Henry V, mother of Henry VI, grandmother of Henry VII, born in 1400, crowned 1421, died 1438. When Henry VII created the Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey, he probably dreamed of it becoming a huge Tudor mausoleum for centuries, but just over 100 years after his victory at Bosworth battlefield, the death of his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would bring the end of the Tudor dynasty. The reality of the Lady Chapel's quest to become a Tudor mausoleum is rather successful, especially as Henry VII, Elizabeth of York, Mary I, Elizabeth I, and Edward VI are buried there, or at least nearby. The only Tudor monarch buried elsewhere is Henry VIII, who did intend to be buried back in Westminster Abbey, but in a huge and grand vault with a colossal tomb and effigy being placed above. The tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, his queen, is very much the centrepiece of the Lady Chapel, and underneath the tomb is a burial vault. This burial vault contains today the remains of not just the king and queen on the effigy of the tomb, but there is also a Stuart king buried there too. When the Lady Chapel was finished, Elizabeth of York, the first Tudor queen, was buried inside of the vault at the heart, and the tomb was then placed on top following the death of Henry VII. The first Tudor monarchs were laid to rest for many decades until the burial vault of the pair would be disturbed with the death of the final Tudor queen, Elizabeth I. As a tribute to the glory of Elizabeth I's reign, she was interred in this burial vault, but she wouldn't be laid to rest there for too long. She was then later taken out of the vault and was placed into a different vault which is around 10 metres away. Her coffin was then buried in the vault of her half-sister Mary I, who is commonly known as Bloody Mary. The tomb today only shows Elizabeth I in all of her royal regalia and glory, and there is only a small plaque showing that Mary I is buried there. This says, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of resurrection." But inside of this burial vault, the coffins of Elizabeth I and Mary I are placed on top of each other, with Elizabeth on the top, showing that she was more important than her half-sister, even in death. The coffins are still left in this way, and also in the burial vault is a small vessel, presumably a lead-lined tin, which contains the hearts of Elizabeth I and Mary I, which were removed after death during the embalming process. One young boy, even whilst he was in the vaults, allegedly touched this and claimed, "Within niches were the urns, one with the name Queen Mary, the other with that of Queen Elizabeth. I dipped my hand into each and took out each of a king of gluttonous red substance, somewhat resembling mortar. Mary's urn contained the least moisture. He had touched the heart of the last Tudor queen." The burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was then later opened again, and this was done to inter the body of King James I following his death, the successor of Elizabeth I and the first Stuart monarch. The reason James I was buried there was probably as he wanted to be compared with the founders of the previous dynasty, as he was the first Scottish king to rule over England too. It is known that to get the body of James I into the burial vault, that the wooden coffins of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York had to be removed, meaning that still today their tightly wrapped remains in the cerecloth are left inside of the burial vault. James I's body was also left in this way. Also buried in a side chapel nearby is the mother of James I, the executed Mary Queen of Scots. She is buried in a large vault under her tomb and effigy, and inside of this vault are many other members of the Stuart royal family who were buried inside there following their deaths. So Westminster Abbey does not have one central burial vault, but instead it has many different burial vaults that house the remains of kings and queens and other high-ranking members of nobility. Some of these vaults contain incredibly wealthy and powerful people from the centuries previous, but the burial vaults are mostly scattered around the Lady Chapel, and the tombs of the medieval kings and queens mostly contain their remains, and they are not necessarily entombed inside of a vault. The royal vault that sits under St George's Chapel today is considered full or close to it, with the coffins of dozens of royals and minor royals inside of it. But what is this, and what does it look like? As a building, St George's Chapel is known as a royal peculiar. It is a building that is under the direct authority of royalty and the monarchy, and it does not necessarily fall inside of a parish. Over the centuries, it became a place where many people were interred and buried, and there were many different chapels that were created inside of St George's for smaller worship and dedication to royals. A chapel was made in Windsor Castle's walls and was rededicated to George the Martyr, but it then became known as St George's Chapel. Throughout the Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period, there was extensive redevelopment to the building, but during the English Civil War, there was a lot of destruction in the building. There was pillaging and plundering by parliamentarian forces, but following the execution of King Charles I, the executed king was buried there, alongside Henry VIII, who had been buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, in a specially built vault. Further changes and restoration was made throughout the reigns of the Georgians and Queen Victoria. One of the first monarchs buried inside of St George's was Edward IV, and it stated that he was to be buried in a vault with a chapel or closest over it, with space for an altar and a tomb with his figure of silver and gilt, or at least copper and gilt. The will further provided for a chantry of 2 priests and for the company of 13 poor bedsmen to live within the college. The king's bones were left for a number of centuries, but they were then discovered when work was done to repair and change parts of St George's to the wishes of King George III.
Edward IV had been buried inside one of the first royal vaults, and the vault itself was small, 9 feet long and under 4 feet wide, and it had a number of arches in it. The remains of a wooden coffin with the skull and bones of Elizabeth Woodville lay on top of a lead coffin, and these had been put in there. The coffin of Edward IV was opened, and his complete skeleton was found, and even shoulder-length brown hair was found on his head. One eyewitness claimed that, when the coffin was opened, the body bore its natural form but soon fell to powder. The point of this is that there were actually a number of individual burial vaults for the royals found inside of the chapel. However, King George III ordered the excavation and building of a proper royal burial vault underneath the floor of the chapel. This became known as the Tomb House, and inside of this vault are a number of different shelves which are held behind iron bars, and today there are 25 bodies of members of the royal family who are buried in their coffins in this part of the royal vault. The bodies are literally slid onto the shelves and then have been left in this manner. One of the first people to be buried in the royal vault was Princess Charlotte in 1817, and she died following giving birth. The tomb house holds the remains of many different royals, including King George III, George IV, William IV, and many of their grandchildren, children, and other family members. The first to be interred in the royal vault was Princess Amelia in 1810, the daughter of George III and his wife Charlotte. There is near to the shelf a few central plinths, and these, the coffins of a number of kings and queens, were placed in the centre, highlighting their importance. Some images of the royal vault even show the coffins carrying a number of crowns. Throughout the centuries, there were some rearrangements and changes to the royal vault, and different monarchs could stipulate the arrangements and organisation of the different coffins. Some had coffins placed on the racking at the side, and others had closer relatives on the plinths in the central point. With regards to gaining access to the royal vault, there is one which is accessed by a staircase for those who have clearance, for example the priests who regularly go and pray down there, but the other entry is through an elevator or a lift mechanism in the central part of the chapel, and this is a hole in the floor which comes up and down, bringing coffins into the royal vault. Coffins are lowered to a chamber below, and this is connected to the royal vault. When the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II took place, the body of the Queen was lowered symbolically into said royal vault, using the electronic lift. Her incredibly heavy coffin was then brought back out of the vault hours after the funeral had taken place, because she was to be buried inside of a small chantry chapel alongside her father, King George VI, and her mother. The remains of Elizabeth II were then interred here. Philip, her consort, Prince Philip as he was better known, had his coffin held inside the royal vault for roughly a year, and this was done so that there would not be two separate interments inside of the memorial chapel. Someone must have known that the Queen did not have long left, or the plan was to always hold Philip's body in the royal vault before burying him with his wife together. The process for burials inside of the royal vault was as followed. The funeral service would take place inside of St George's Chapel, followed by the committal, and this would see the coffin being lowered into the royal vault using the lift fitted into the chapel near to the altar. The coffin was then either placed on the central part of the vault, or it was stored away on the different shelvings held behind the iron railings. The vault itself is believed to have been rather cool. It is not refrigerated, leading to the conclusion that the remains tend to stay in a good sense of preservation due to the temperature. There are other small vaults as mentioned, but these are not the actual royal vault, for example Henry VIII's vault, and also Elizabeth II's.
The chapel of St Peter ad Vincula today sits very close to the oldest part of the Tower of London, known as the White Tower. It was founded around the year 1110 by Henry I, and to begin with, this chapel was outside of the original walls of the Tower of London, and it was built so that the king could worship in public and that the people of London could see their monarch undertaking his religious duties. The small chapel continued to be used for many years,
and as the Tower of London expanded and underwent huge renovations, the curtain walls enveloped and swallowed the chapel up so that it would be forever within the fortress as it still is today. But the church today contains many different monuments and dedications, including those who governed the tower and looked after the day-to-day running of it, but the church is the burial place to some of the most famous prisoners who were held under lock and key, including 2 of Henry VIII's queens and wives and the 9-day queen. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, and her downfall was plotted by Thomas Cromwell, as the king wanted to rid of Anne and he wanted to marry Jane Seymour. Anne was accused of incest, treason and adultery, and she would be executed inside the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn had her head struck clean off of her shoulders by an expert executioner and swordsman who had been brought over from France. Anne, following her execution, was then placed into an oak chest used for bow staves, and her body was then taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There was no huge funeral, but she was quietly thrown into a grave near to the altar, and her ladies watched as the earth was thrown over her remains. Anne's burial inside of the chapel was the first of a royal who had been executed inside the tower's walls, and she was the first royal to be interred there. Kings and queens had died inside the tower walls before, but, well, for example, King Henry VI was murdered there, and also Elizabeth of York died inside the tower giving birth, but these 2 were both buried elsewhere. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was not intended to be a site of royal burial at all. The next royal who lost her head inside the tower was Henry VIII's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, and she had been condemned to death for cheating on the king and for treason. Catherine Howard was not executed by sword, but instead was executed by the commoner's axe, which was said to have been less reliable and more problematic. This took place on the 13th of February, 1542, and the skilled axeman took her head off in one clean blow. After her execution, her remains were collected up in a sheet, and they were then taken into the chapel and thrown into a roughly dug grave, but Henry VIII had given instructions for her remains to be covered in quicklime to dissolve and decompose them quicker. And this led to Catherine Howard's remains never being found inside the chapel. Now, the final royal, or queen, buried inside there is Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen who ruled after Edward VI. Jane was deposed by Queen Mary I, the oldest daughter of Henry VIII, and she remained inside the Tower of London as a prisoner where she had been before for awaiting her coronation. It looked as if Jane would be spared, but the reality of the situation was too grave for Mary I, as Jane posed a serious threat to her reign. Lady Jane Grey was either 16 or 17 when she was executed by axe inside the Tower of London, and like Anne Boleyn, she was buried with some degree of dignity. There were many other victims of the Tower of London who were buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, including Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who had royal blood through her uncle being King Edward IV, and there was also Jane Boleyn, who was executed alongside Catherine Howard, Robert Devereux, the once favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, and some of the Tudor period's most notorious people. Many people who lost their heads upon Tower Hill were also buried in the chapel, including Thomas Cromwell, Sir Thomas More, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, and the illegitimate son of Charles II, and Bishop John Fisher. But over the centuries following the Tudor period, the chapel fell into a state of disrepair, and it was certainly somewhere which was not fit as a royal burial site. Because of this, during the reign of Queen Victoria, there was a huge amount of renovation work performed, and this led to the exhumation of many people who were buried inside the small church. This included Anne Boleyn, whose remains were found. On the 9th of November 1876, the workers dug up and exhumed Anne Boleyn, the executed second wife of Henry VIII. Her remains had been found where they were recorded, and they were found in front of the high altar, and 5 men had gathered to exhume her. They began to lift the pavement, and at a depth of 2 feet the body of Anne Boleyn was found. Her bones had been heaped together in one spot, but the grave had been disturbed by a collapsing, decaying coffin of a 54-year-old woman named Hannah Beresford, who had been buried close to Anne in 1750. Because of the discovery of the body of the Queen, the royal doctor, Dr. Frederick Mowat, was summoned to the Tower, and his team then carefully recorded and forensically examined the remains of the Queen. Of course, they were looking for signs of a woman who had lost her head by decapitation in a brutal manner, and this is what they found, and Dr. Mowat stated of the remains that they belonged to a female between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, and that they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. A later, more thorough examination concluded. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Anne Boleyn's body was then placed inside of a new coffin, a small lead container, and a plaque was placed upon her coffin ready for reburial. As mentioned, the body of Catherine Howard was not found, possibly due to the quicklime which had been added on her remains upon the King's orders, this substance decomposing her remains much quicker. But they may also not have been found due to the age that she was when she was executed, and that her bones had not hardened, meaning that she would have disappeared into the ground quicker than adult bones. Lady Jane's remains were also discovered and found. The chapel's building work was completed and finished, and with this, remains were then placed back into the ground. The most prominent burials were placed under the altar, with James Scott, the illegitimate son of Charles I, being buried directly beneath it. This area below the altar became an unofficial royal burial vault, as the remains of Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane were interred directly there. There is a memorial plaque marking these sites today, as is there one for Catherine Howard, but this is just a memorial to her, and there is no remains of Henry VIII's fifth wife buried under the stones, as her remains were never found. There is also a crypt inside the Tower of London's chapel, and this has become a place where many lesser people were interred, such as Thomas Cromwell, and this is today not accessible to the public. The remains, the corpses of Sir Thomas More, is also interred here. It's in its own tomb without a head. The chapel has been described as no sadder spot on earth than that little cemetery. Death is there associated, not as in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, with genius and virtue, with public veneration and with imperishable renown, not as in our humblest churches and churchyards, with everything that is most endearing in social and domestic charities, but with whatever is darkest in human nature and in human destiny, with the savage triumph of implacable enemies, with the inconstancy, the ingratitude, the cowardice of friends, and with all the miseries of fallen greatness and blighted fame. Thither have been carried through successive ages by the rude hands of jailers, without one mourner following, the bleeding relics of men who had been the captains of armies, the leaders of parties, the oracles of senates, and the ornaments of courts. Today, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula can be visited, and it is a poignant place where queens are buried. Recently, when we visited, we saw a beefeater having a quiet moment of reflection upon the gravestone and sit where Anne Boleyn was buried. A solitary red rose was laid on her grave marker out of respect for a queen who lost her head 500 years ago. It is a much quieter sight than Westminster Abbey and St. George's Chapel,
but today it is still a site of royal burial. The Royal Burial Ground, as it is known, is in the grounds of Frogmore Estate in Home Park in Windsor, and was created because of the royal vault under St George's Chapel in Windsor becoming very full. There had been 23 separate interments in the chapel in just over a century, and despite this sounding like not many, because the royal family is rather large, there was less space to inter the royals. In fact, Queen Elizabeth II commissioned her own small Chantry chapel to be made as an add-on to St George's Chapel for her father, George VI, and her mother, Elizabeth the Queen Mother, to be interred and buried. This is where Elizabeth II and her consort Prince Philip were laid to rest, but because of the space in the chapel running out, a more simple cemetery was created on the royal Frogmore estate. Frogmore House was brought by the Crown, specifically George III, for his wife, Queen Charlotte, in 1792. He also purchased the estate around it. It consists of around 30 acres of private gardens, and it is the site of 2 different mausoleums. It houses the Royal Mausoleum, containing the tombs of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, as well as the Duchess of Kent's mausoleum, housing the remains of Queen Victoria's mother, and there is also the Royal Burial Ground. This, in a sense, is an overspill burial ground and cemetery for those members of the royal family who are of lesser status, and it's most probable that those who do not become kings and queens or monarchs in the future, decades and centuries, that they will be buried here. Queen Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, lived here for her final years at Frogmore, and in the 1850s she began construction work on a temple there. The top of this structure was to be a summer house, and the lower part would be her burial place. By the time that she died in March of 1861, the building work on the mausoleum had not been finished, and the whole building became a mausoleum. But then, in the very same year, on December 14th, 1861, Prince Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria, died at the age of 42, to much shock. He had been ill for some time and was a rather sickly man, but in the days after Albert's death, Victoria drew up plans for a new mausoleum for her husband, where one day she would also be interred and buried. What was created was known as the Royal Mausoleum, and in the centre of this is a huge tomb of Victoria and Albert, and the effigies on top of the tomb were made at the same time. Despite Victoria at the time not being dead, her effigy was stored for roughly 40 years, but Prince Albert was interred at a later date inside of the mausoleum. In total, the crypt under the mausoleum was built with 9 spaces for Victoria's children, but none of these spaces inside the crypt and vault were ever used, meaning that inside of this royal mausoleum, only Victoria and Albert are laid to rest. There is, inside of this mausoleum, a memorial to Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's daughter, who died in 1878 from diphtheria. Victoria and Prince Albert had intended for some time to be buried in a special resting place together, and the mausoleum was thought to have been the perfect place for them. In total, it cost around £23 million to create, and it was described as the finest piece of Victorian funerary architecture in Britain. An inscription above the door of the mausoleum states that part of Prince Albert, which was mortal, the mourning widow Queen Victoria willed to be buried in this tomb. The year of our Lord 1862, farewell, thou most desired. Here at the last I shall rest with thee, I shall rise up with thee in Christ. There was a huge problem with the Royal Mausoleum, though, as Frogmore as an estate gains its name from the wet, harshy grounds and location. The mausoleum was built in a rather significantly damp part of the site, and over years water has seeped into the building, and it has suffered from a very bad damp issue. The original drainage system which was installed also has caused problems, leading to the possibility that Victoria and Albert's crypt could be significantly water damaged, if not waterlogged, meaning their corpses and remains could have been at risk of quicker decomposition. There has been a lot of work done on the site to try and sort this out, but still, there is a significant amount of work to be done to protect it for years to come.
But around the mausoleum is, of course, the royal burial ground of Frogmore. This is incredibly different as a burial site, as instead of large tombs being created and crafted inside of Westminster or St George's Chapel, the royal burial ground is more modest and takes the form of a cemetery, like those who are not royalty would use. There are many members of the royal family buried in this burial ground, and usually those who were not sovereigns or their consorts have been buried there, including Queen Victoria's children, Helena, Arthur and Louis, and there is one sovereign and monarch interred inside of the royal burial ground, and this is Edward VIII. Edward, of course, died as the Duke of Windsor as he abdicated from the throne due to his wish to pursue a marriage with the divorced American Wallis Simpson. When it became clear to Edward that he could not continue as monarch if he wished to marry Simpson, he abdicated in favour of his brother George VI, who, father of Elizabeth II, and who would lead the nation in the fight against the Nazis during World War II. Edward's legacy is one which is tainted, as it is known that he was a Nazi sympathiser and someone who would meet with Hitler, and Hitler even planned to restore him to the throne if he had taken Britain. But Edward VIII is the only sovereign buried inside of the burial ground at Frogmore. Buried next to Edward is Wallis Simpson, his wife, and her burial inside of the cemetery is considered rather controversial. The first burials inside of this royal burial ground took place in 1928 as Prince Harold of Schleswig-Holstein, Prince Francis of Teck, Princess Louise Margaret, Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Lord Leopold Mountbatten, Princess Helena, Adolphus Cambridge and Rupert Cambridge were buried there. They were all interred inside of the royal vault in St George's Chapel and were then moved and interred when the cemetery was established. Further burials took place in the years later, including notably Princess Victoria, the daughter of King Edward VII, Princess Louise, the Duchess of Agril, the daughter of Queen Victoria. Further children of monarchs, including the sons of George V, Prince George and Edward, were buried in the burial ground. From this point on, most of the funeral ceremonies took place at St George's Chapel, a short distance away, and then the interment would take place inside of the burial ground after. There is one exhumation that took place in the burial ground, as Queen Maria, the Queen Mother of Yugoslavia, the wife of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, had been buried there. She died in exile in London and was interred in the royal burial ground, but her remains were exhumed on the 26th of April 2013 and were repatriated to Serbia. It is most likely from now on that the members of the royal family who are not monarchs or their consorts will be interred inside of Frogmore's burial ground. This is the fate of most of them, and they know that one day they will be laid to rest alongside Edward VIII and others. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.